Soos genoem gesels ek met Kulani Siweya van Agri Suid-Afrika, hy is hulle hoof-ekonoom. Kulani, welcome to Grootplaas.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's such a pleasure. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about Agri SA's proposed diesel rebate increase.
Yeah, I think it would be prudent maybe just to set the scene and contextualize
Please
it.
do.
Yeah, I mean, the diesel rebate scheme is a form of incentive from government as well as the South African Revenue Services. And that's aimed to protecting industries from international competitors, particularly those that are getting some producer support. So as it stands, depending on the industry, you'll be cushioned from some of the diesel rebate or the cost of diesel in that regard. So as agriculture, we qualify for 40% of the fuel levy and 100% of the road accident fund. So what farmers are then able to do is that, given that the tractors or their farming vehicles are not used on commercial roads, they can then claim a form of rebate from the diesel that they buy to use on these particular vehicles on their farms.
Wonderful. If we take a step back, what does this mean for the average citizen?
Yeah, so what this means is that we are securing food security. I know that sounds a bit tautologous in this regard.
Absolutely.
Given the fact that, remember, with the increased input costs that we're seeing across the board, it has become a bit more expensive for farmers to produce food.
Yes, exactly.
And we know very well how much we need the food in this particular country. So what the farmers are then able to do is that they cushion from the blows of this increased input prices, particularly when it comes to fuel prices, and it then obviously has a ripple effect to the consumers, and food becomes a bit cheaper.
If we talk to the average man on the street, just give me a simple explanation of how it'll work, and what is this rebate? I mean, what is it?
Yeah, so as I said before, it is aimed at protecting industries from international competitors, but also provide a relief for farmers or for particular industries that are using vehicles not on the roads that like you and I when we drive, but actually on the farms. So if I'm a farmer and I'm going to buy diesel to use for my tractor, I'm able to claim a particular percentage out of that particular purchase, which is 80% of that purchase. As it currently stands today, the diesel rebate stands at 366. So as a farmer, I'm liable to then to go claim for that particular rebate away from my tax incentives.
That's wonderful. So you talked about food security, which is a very important thing. Why is a relief to farmers specifically needed if we put the focus on the agriculture industry?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things that we need to remember is that the South African farming industry receives little to no direct government support compared to our international competitors. So you can just imagine how already difficult it is.
It's actually scary.
It is actually, but I must say that our sector is quite resilient and quite agile, given all these input costs that have been rising, given all the challenges. The farmers are still able to produce the food. So this is a form of incentive that's in place that aids the farmers themselves to cushion the blows in this particular regard. So when you do have a diesel rebate scheme, it secures food security, but it just also ensures that there's other forms of benefits, so like employment that comes through, the viability of the sector and the growth of the sector and sustainability thereof going forward.
And obviously from Agri SA, you guys are on the ground. There's a lot of farmers involved. What are, at the moment, some of the biggest challenges that farmers are experiencing, despite the high fuel?
Yeah, so there's a lot. From the one side, there was a bit of concerns earlier on in the season. Given the rains that we saw in the earlier parts, we were worried about yields. But as it stands with the current data that we're seeing, it doesn't seem as if there's too much to be concerned about. But there's also external factors like the geopolitical scenarios and environment that you're operating in, particularly when it comes to the Ukraine and Russia situation that's playing out currently. So on the one hand, you're seeing fertilizer prices going up, you're seeing fuel prices going up, and other forms of input costs like electricity as well. So the farmers are really feeling the pressure. But this also comes with also a cost, a particular income crunch when you consider that some of the markets that they're exporting to are not receiving the fruits given the geopolitical situation, but also even the pricing thereof is not at an ideal stage. So the farmers do need a form of cushioning in this current climate that we find ourselves in. And they are saying that it is very needed, and this is one of the ways that they are really appreciative to kind of have an incentive of this sort.
Just to go a little bit off topic for a few seconds, what is the latest when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine How are we feeling the impact directly at the moment?
Yeah, so remember, Russia and Ukraine are significant players in wheat export. They produce about a quarter of the global wheat exports that we use. And in South Africa, we're a net importer of wheat. We import about 30% of our wheat from these particular countries. So as it stands, there's a concern of a global shortage when it comes to wheat. And remember, this is a staple for countries like South Africa. The situation hasn't abated as much. It does seem as if it has quietened down, but the ripple effects are still in place. But never mind the wheat side of things. These particular countries are also significant players in producing of fertilizer as well as fuel when you consider Russia. So the fuel prices that we've all been complaining about has been a result of this current situation. And as long as this is still continuing or still persists, we then still have a risk of fuel prices going even higher than what we've seen before, alongside other input costs like fertilizer as well as fuel.
We're almost going to break. Before we go, we've got about 1 minute left. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Anything to be excited about at the moment?
I'm always the bearer of bad news in this kind of platforms.
Bring the good news.
I will say that it is quite encouraging that the National Treasury is actually concerned as much as we are on this particular situation. So they're willing to come to the table to have a discussion on just the structure of fuel prices in this regard. But also as Agri SA, going back to the initial topic of the diesel rebate, we're also pushing for a higher percentage. Remember, I said initially that as farmers, we qualify for 40% of the fuel levy as well as 100% of the road accident fund. We're trying to engage with National Treasury to maybe push up the fuel levy incentive part that we have to maybe 50, 60%. That will go a very long way in ensuring that farmers are sustainable, are viable, and also cushion from this particular impact. And again, securing food security in South Africa.
That is the biggest thing. Yes. We can't stress that enough because it's so important.
Definitely, yeah.
Kulani, we're going to be back just now. Bly net waar jy is. Ons is nou terug. Nou, ek is steeds in die ateljee met Kulani Siweya van Agri SA. Kulani, when we look at this proposal from Agri SA, that is going to advantage farmers because they need the help. What are some of the already seen effects of high fuel on the agriculture sector? If we go to the ground, I mean, you guys work with farmers.
Yeah, so currently as we're recording this, or as we're having this particular interview, it is harvest season for the summer grains. So demand for diesel is quite high right now. But at the same time, there's also the planting of the winter crops, which is wheat. So there's also demand in this regard. Again, we did say initially that we want farmers to produce food in a much more affordable manner. And as it stands with the current predicament that we're facing from geopolitical factors, fuel prices are quite high. And there's no end in sight as long as this is particularly playing out. And if there's no any form of incentive that is on the board or any form of restructuring of the fuel prices as it stands. So the farmers are concerned going forward, but they remain hopeful and they remain resilient and just get on with the business themselves. But I think it's also worth noting as well that the food price increases that we're also seeing on a retail side is not necessarily coming from the farms. The farmers don't necessarily pass on the cost to the consumers. They're also price takers. The food price increase that we've been seeing has been as a result of retailers marking up on their prices to account for this higher transportation of food from the farms to the shelves in this particular regard.
Would you say that Agri SA's proposal in this regard is a strategic, targeted proposal?
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Remember, as I did mention earlier on, that the South African farming industry is competing with countries that have producer support from their governments. And as South African farmers, there is little to no direct government support. So such incentives go a very long way. So on the one hand, we want to protect this kind of incentive for the farmers to still have it in place because, again, it cushions them from the high fuel prices. But it also aids them in making sure that they're sustainable going forward. And this is particularly important given that the sector is a key player in the economy on many fronts. You know, I always say that the agricultural sector is a low-hanging fruit in solving some of the social ails that we have in the economy. From one, unemployment. The sector is very labor-intensive. So for as long as farmers are still on the ground and are sustainable and able to produce food, then there'll be demand for labor and we'll be able to then to deal with such social ills that we have in the economy.
Why is it the case that in South Africa there isn't, in this industry, help from government?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question.
I don't know if you're the right person to ask. I'm just thinking now, it's so random. Why is that the case?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a challenge to respond to. However, but the biggest thing is also political will from the government themselves. But I understand on the one hand that they're also quite constrained on their purses. They can't really give out much producer support. But there's also programs that need to be coordinated. There are indirect forms of programs that are in place, but they're just too disjointed and scattered all over the show. I think it would be prudent for government to come together, have these particular programs in one spot and just make sure that they are coordinated in a manner that they directly benefit the farmers on the ground, and that would go a very long way in ensuring that the sector is still competitive in the global landscape.
What are some of the predictions in the sector at the moment? Yeah,
so from a production side, there isn't too much concern. We're looking at a good harvesting season so far when it comes to the grains. We're also hearing that the export market is also still going on as planned. There is a bit of challenges when it comes to supply chain constraints, given the geopolitical stuff that we've been talking about throughout the interview. But as it stands from a production side of things, the farmers are still on a good front. I think what then becomes a bit of a challenge is when we then look at inflation that is induced by this particular high input costs. That does have an implication on many things, including interest rates, which can mean that farmers themselves may pay even more for some of the farming debt that enables them to farm and produce food on that regard. So I think inflation and global food prices is the biggest risk that we're contending with currently, but from a production side, the sector is still on a very good footing.
Do you think the sector has recovered from the challenges that the COVID-19 that it brought to the industry?
Yeah, so luckily during the COVID-19 pandemic, the sector was classified as an essential service, and as a result, farming activities still continued as normal. So the sector wasn't necessarily impacted per se. It was really cushioned from this effect, and I think for the longest of times during the pandemic and during that period, we saw the sector even growing from a trade point of view as well.
Do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, so the sector, as I said, remains very, very strategic in the economy. It is that one sector that is a low-hanging fruit in solving many of these things. It has proven time and time again, and again, even during the pandemic, that it's a very agile sector, it's a very resilient sector, it's a very robust sector and very complex in terms of the food system. So it is imperative for government to note this and ensure that they support the farmers as best as possible. The diesel rebate is one of the ways. It's a very critical incentive that the farmers get themselves. And we would hope that the government does heed to our core and just adjust the diesel rebate to benefit the farmers to ultimately secure food security in the country and solve other forms of social ailments.
We've got about 1 minute left. When do you guys expect an answer on this question?
Luckily, we've got a very good relationship with the government in terms of our engagement. So we're constantly in engagement with them on this particular matter. As to when we will get an answer, it will just depend on how much pressure we actually do put on them. But luckily, right now, the conversation is ongoing, given the fuel suspension, the suspension of the fuel levy, well, the 150. So that, while it's still playing out in the next couple of months, we are constantly engaging with government, and hopefully we'll get a more sustainable solution going out into the outer years and months.
I look forward to the update. Thank you, Kulani. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Dankie dat jy ingeskakel het. Ons is by die einde van die program. Jy moet net daar bly waar jy is, want die groot ontbyt is volgende. En dit beloof om 'n interessante program te wees. So ek groet jou, mag jy 'n wonderlike dag verder hê.